Let's write a function rand_sample, which takes as input two integers m and n, and as output returns a vector v, where v is a length n vector containing randomly chosen integers from 1 to m. Well, for this phrasing, it turns out this isn't quite what I want, but for this phrasing, it couldn't be any easier if we know about rand_i. So in rand_i, the first input is supposed to be the upper bound. So in this case, we're going from 1 to m. So m is my upper bound. And the second input is supposed to be the size. And I want the size to be n different integers. So let's think of that as a length n row vector. So the size would be 1 row, n columns. And this is almost perfect, but remember you have to specify the output. So here I'm specifying that the output v is this rand_i vector. And so let's test it. So let's try rand_sample 10.3. Yep, looks good. But it turns out that how I want to apply this function is by choose a random subset of some vector. And I'm going to start with a length 10 vector and choosing the second, the eighth, and the eighth inputs in the vector or entries in the vector. That's not very natural for the applications I have in mind for data analysis, where I'm given some testing data and I want to decide okay, let's only test with a subset of that data. And I don't really want to use the second, the eighth, and the eighth. I really want to have 3 distinct numbers in here. So that's what makes this more difficult. So the quick way to say this is without replacement. Hey, or another way to say it is with no number appearing twice. And this is going to make the question a lot harder to solve. So I want to choose numbers from 1 to m. So let's first get access to those numbers by naming the vector a to be the integers from 1 to m. And my output v, I'm going to build that up one element at a time. So let's start with an empty vector. Okay, a vector of length 0. And I will be done once I get a vector of length n. So I want to finish when the vector has length n. So I want to continue while the vector has length strictly less than n. And I want to put a random element from a onto this vector. So let's first choose a random index for a. So let's take I to be rand_i from 1 to the length of a. And you might say, oh, well, why not just use m, since a is always length m? Well, I'm going to shorten a. So that's why I'm using length of a here, because in a later step, I'm going to start changing the length of a. And now we're going to put the ith entry in a onto v. So v equals v a of I. And now I'm going to delete the ith entry in a, and so this is where the length of a changes. Okay, so that deletes the ith entry in v. And let's save it, and let's test it. Rand_sample 10.3. Okay, seems to still be working, but maybe I'm just getting lucky and there's no repetitions, but maybe it could have repetitions. So let's try, instead of just taking 10 sample values, or instead of just taking 3 sample values, let's take 10 sample values. And there are no repetitions, so the chances of that happening are very small. So this is a good sign that I've defined it correctly. If I want to be even more confident, let's try taking 11 of these, and we should get an error. Yep, I got an error because I was trying to choose something from an empty vector. And maybe I would rather have the end result be sorted. Well, that's really easy to do. I can just go back here, and at the end, I can say v equals sort v. Okay, if I just had sort v without the v equals on the left, this would be wrong because this would not actually change the value of v, and the old value of v would get output. But since I have v equals sort v, that does change the value. So let's save it. And now let's try rand sample 1010 again. And how about rand sample 106? So there is a random sample of 6 values of the integers from 1 to 10.